Just before the ceremony, my own son approached me and said the cruelest words a mother could ever hear. If you had already died, my marriage would have been better because I would already have the inheritance. At that moment, my legs weakened. My heart nearly stopped. I, who had dreamed of crying with emotion at the altar, cried with pain inside, hidden from everyone. What he didn't know was that I was a billionaire. And it was exactly on that day, in front of everyone, that he discovered the truth. Life revealed my secret and showed him the bitter price of ingratitude. I remember the smell of brewed coffee wafting through the kitchen that morning. I opened my planner and wrote, with a trembling hand, my son's wedding. It wasn't just a commitment. It was a rite of passage, a full stop, and a new chapter in our story. As I stirred the sugar in my cup, I thought about the flowers, the soft music, the simple yet dignified dress I'd chosen. I didn't want pomp, I wanted truth. I took a deep breath and listened to the birds outside, as if saying, "It'll work out, ma'am." If there's one thing that age brings, it's this delicate conversation with time. I started with the small details, because they're what hold the world together when emotion tries to bring everything crashing down. I listed linen napkins, light-colored tablecloths, the warm light of late afternoon in the church. I called Mrs. Lurd from the catering, an old acquaintance, and asked for the menu that embraces warm bread, fresh salad, a hearty roast. Nothing overdone, no dishes no one can pronounce. I wanted my guests to feel at home, not on a catwalk. Perhaps, deep down, I wanted to prove that simplicity is also luxury. At Mr. Antenner's stationery store, I picked up invitations with thick paper, soft to the touch, letters that seemed to whisper respect. I ran my finger along the edges and felt a gentle pride, the kind that doesn't need to shout. I chose a creamy shade, almost ivory, like ancient skin that holds stories. The woman asked if I wanted gold, glitter, and a bow. I smiled and said, "My dear, too much glitter overshadows the bride's face." She laughed, understanding, and I left with the bag in my arm and a sense of relief in my chest. I visited the church alone, late in the afternoon, when the sun streamed through the stained glass windows and painted the floor with colors I can't even name. I sat in the last pew, as I always did, and remembered my boy kneeling during his first sacraments, his hair falling over his forehead, and the stubborn demeanor of someone who already knew how to argue with God. The wood smelled of wax and time. I closed my eyes and said a short prayer. May it be beautiful, Lord, and may it be enough. I never asked for greatness, only truth. At home, I spread flower samples on the table, chrysanthemums, garden roses, baby's breath, all humble and fragrant. I tried low arrangements so as not to disturb conversation, because a good marriage involves laughter spread across the table. I placed my hands on each stem, as if blessing. I know how to choose beautiful silence, and flowers are also silence. I didn't want those glass towers that tremble with the music. I wanted the scent of a backyard, of family Sundays, of hugs. When I called the musician, I asked for a guitar, soft chords, nothing more important than the bride and groom's voices. He suggested an electric piano, and I said maybe, but deep down, the answer was already no. Music, for me, has to fit in my memory without scratching. I imagined the wedding march with a simple fingering, almost a conversation between notes. And for a moment, I found myself dancing alone in the living room, my feet slow, my knees complaining, my heart grateful. Just me and the air. The dress, oh, my dress. I tried on 3, 4, 5, and they all seemed like costumes that didn't belong to me. I finally settled on a fabric that draped like water, the color of milky tea, with subtle sleeves, a neckline that respected its age and history. I looked in the mirror and saw my mother behind me, adjusting my hem as she had done when I was young. Go on like this, my daughter. Go on. I choked back my tears and whispered, I will, Mom. The mirror revealed a whole woman. I did the math in my notebook, as always, straight columns, numbers that obey the pencil. Every expense noted, every agreement negotiated, every NO I had to say to avoid getting lost. Money, when treated well, becomes care. And I wanted to care. Not out of petty economy, but out of a principle that follows me like a cool shadow. The essential has a firm outline. Anyone who has lived long enough knows that the abundance that is not displayed is the one that sustains. Between calls, I found myself remembering his first birthday, the crooked cake, the candles they insisted on blowing out before the happy birthday song. I had nothing but a courage that hurt and a love that pushed me. Now, so many years later, I had choices. And I chose what I always chose. Love with my feet on the ground. With each little gift, I embroidered a stitch in the fabric of that day. A stitch of longing, a stitch of hope, a stitch of faith. There were, of course, those who whispered in my ear, Take care, woman. Marriage only happens once. It deserves to shine. I smiled, thanked her, and suppressed the urge to explain how much shine I keep inside. Because what shines on the outside is often just varnish. And varnish cracks. I preferred the good wood, the sound of the guitar, the smell of bread. I preferred the well-set table and the attentive gaze upon those who arrive. I preferred, above all, being able to sleep peacefully the night before, without bills tugging at my ankles. That night, I closed the window, turned off the lights, and listened to the house breathe. The clocks, the refrigerator, my old bones. I felt a gentle, almost shy joy at having aligned the pieces the way I'd learned to align life. Patiently, simply, firmly. I swear, by all that's sacred, that I only wished it would be beautiful and enough. Little did I know, and life likes to play tricks here, that what's enough for a mother sometimes feels more like a lack for a child. And that would still weigh heavily. I realized early on, in our first meetings with the wedding planner, that my son's dream was wrapped in satin ribbon, crystal chandeliers, and mirrored carpets. It was all concept, all sensory experience, all Instagrammable. He spoke with his hands, fast, his eyes shining not with love, but with spectacle. Mom, imagine the entrance with 1,000 hanging candles. 1,000 hanging. I listened and smiled, feeling the weight of the word thousand slip into my bag, where the account notebook stared at me silently. In the following days, he sent me references via cell phone, salons with infinite ceilings, marble tables, arrangements like forests of expensive flowers I couldn't even pronounce. This is the bare minimum, Mom. The bare minimum. The word came cold, cutting like a knife through stale bread. I, who had always made the most of the least, took a deep breath. I remembered our backyard parties, the string of streamers I'd cut myself. You deserve a big dream, I said. But big for whom? For your heart or for the eyes of others? He wanted a string quartet, more DJs, more sax in the middle of the dance floor. He wanted an ice bar, an orchid corridor, fireworks synchronized to the beat. And above all, he wanted me to say yes without hesitation. If other mothers do it, why don't you? I heard the question that wasn't a question, it was a sentence. The smell of imported perfume in the air, the taste of artificial flowers in my mouth. I went to the window and let the wind in. The wind, at least, doesn't charge by the hour. One afternoon, we sat face to face with the decorator. She opened the folder, and the figures leaped out, alive, like shy creatures. I saw his face light up, and I also saw the shadow of my silence grow. We can close today, she said. My tongue tightened. Let's think about it, I replied slowly, like someone holding the reins of a frightened horse. He crooked his smile, that smile he learned late, and uses as a shield. Think about what, Mom? It's my wedding. It was his. But it was also my son. And that changes everything. Son, what do you want to buy with all that light? I asked quietly, so as not to offend him with my curiosity. He laughed impatiently. I want a souvenir, Mom. I want people to talk about my wedding for years to come. Souvenir or applause? Memory or headline? Age gives us those glasses without prescription, but which see deeply. I remembered his father, who said, "What lasts is what doesn't need to be seen." I swallowed my longing and let the phrase sleep between us, like a tired bird on the edge of the table. There was a night when he arrived late, reeking of anxiety. "They've closed the salon of my dreams, Mom. We need to decide now." His now was always an urgency that pushed, that squeezed, that didn't give his heart time to catch up. I went to the kitchen and served him a bowl of soup. He didn't even touch it. His eyes devoured imaginary lights, while the soup actually grew cold. "My son, we also light up from within." He didn't answer, and his silence told me everything. In family groups, the comparisons began. Wedding photos of cousins, acquaintances, friends' children. Floats, waterfalls, silverware that looked like jewels. "See, Mom? This is how it's done today." Today. That word that sounds like a decree. I felt ancient, and maybe I am. But ancient isn't synonymous with wrong. Ancient is synonymous with root. And root holds a tree together. What withstands the wind isn't the ribbon of the bough, it's the knot in the wood. I returned to the church alone, as if consulting a confidant. I sat on the same pew, ran my hand over the polished wood, and said another prayer. May he understand value without the label Lord. For a moment, I heard imaginary footsteps, the rustle of flowers in the aisle, the whisper of dresses. Everything is beautiful, yes. But beautiful doesn't need to shout. Beautiful can whisper and still be unforgettable. Would he hear that whisper? Would his heart still know how to listen? In a more heated conversation, he blurted out, "I work hard. I deserve the best." I nodded. He works hard. He deserves it. Who said otherwise? But the best sometimes means something else. The best is peace after the party, my son. He scoffed, with a short laugh. Peace doesn't get a photo. Peace doesn't get a comment. Peace doesn't become a trending topic. I kept quiet, so as not to lose the thread. When we love, we choose which battles are worth the scar. Deep down, I feared that luxury would become a crutch, that external beauty would try to plug an internal hole. Holes can't be filled with rare flowers. Holes demand a name, a hug, a truth. I stared at his hands, large, firm, restless, and wanted to squeeze them like I had when I was a boy. I didn't. Time had already taken that right. I left the conversation with a tentative agreement and a metallic taste in my mouth. I would hold the reins, but for how long? And at what cost? Because I could already hear, in the distance, the crack of something that was yet to break. It was at this point that I began to notice the whispers. They weren't loud words, but sidelong glances, comparisons disguised as backhanded compliments. Oh, so-and-so had her daughter's wedding at the most expensive venue in town. It was spectacular, but yours will be beautiful too, right? I smiled and nodded, while inside, I felt the poking of a hot iron. It wasn't about the wedding, I already knew that. It was about a son who confused glitter with love and love with status. In meetings with suppliers, he indulged in irony. Mom, this arrangement is so simple. It looks like a school party. A school party. That hit home, because I remembered the little parties I'd throw in the backyard, when there wasn't even enough money for balloons. He laughed lightly, finding it amusing, but each laugh was like a nail hammered into my chest. I remained silent because silence is also defense. At Sunday lunches, he would spout off random but venomous remarks. If it were Mrs. So-and-so, I would have already closed a 5-star restaurant. I chewed slowly, feeling the taste of my food fade. It wasn't envy, it was pressure. A pressure that diminished me in the face of the table I myself served. And I asked myself, where did I go wrong in the lesson of teaching that the value of life doesn't fit into a label? One afternoon, he arrived with a folder full of photos, all of them of cinematic weddings, worthy of magazines. He tossed them on the table and said, "This is what I want." I leafed through them slowly, each page more ostentatious. "What if I can't?" I ventured to ask. He sighed loudly, that sigh that hurts more than any scream. "There's always a but, right, Mom?" I stared at his hands, the same ones that had once held my finger in the crib. Now they were hands that asked for the world. "I'm not made of iron." Sometimes at night I would cry softly into my pillow, not because of the criticism itself, but because of the emptiness it revealed. The emptiness of recognition, of gratitude. The same son whose sleeping forehead I had kissed so often now threw words at me like stones. And yet, I'd gather those stones and keep them in my pocket, because a mother always keeps them, even when they're heavy. Comparisons even came from outside. "Wow, but aren't you going to throw a lavish wedding? Your son deserves it." Yes, he does. He deserves love. He deserves respect. He deserves the presence of those who love him. But does he deserve luxury? This question lingered. And I remembered my youth, when luxury meant having rice and beans together on the same plate. Time passes, but certain memories stick to your skin like an invisible tattoo. One day, in the bride's fitting room, I heard him whispering to his future wife, "It could be better, but it's what it is." There I was, pretending to pick up a pin, and my legs felt weak. What it is? As if it were a handout. As if it were too little. As if it were undignified. The poor bride smiled awkwardly and squeezed his hand. Perhaps you also knew that his brilliance cost too much. One rainy afternoon, I sat on the porch and watched the water run down the yard. I remembered when he was a boy and ran through the mud, happy just to have a plastic toy car. "Mom, look," he'd shout, and the whole world could fit in that cry. Now, that same son looked at flowers and towels and said, "It's not enough." How could life change so suddenly? I was hiding it, it's true, pretending it didn't affect me, that I had a thick skin. But inside, every sentence he said dug a hole. And the more he spoke, the more I understood that ingratitude is a knife that cuts slowly, unhurriedly, but with precision. And it cuts deep, very deep. And yet, I kept it all to myself. Because I knew, or perhaps sensed, that one day this arrogance would come at a price. And that he would discover, sooner or later, that life exacts its toll. But at that moment, all I had was my silence. And silence is heavy when carried alone. It's hard to explain the feeling of raising a son with such care and then suddenly seeing him spit on everything that once gave him a foundation. Ingratitude doesn't arrive like a storm. No, it seeps slowly, like a seepage we only notice when the wall is already stained. Every comment from him, every sidelong glance, corroded from within what I'd built with so much sweat. And I wondered, my chest tightening, at what point did he stop seeing his mother and see only money? Sometimes I'd lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, remembering the early mornings I'd stay up sewing, embroidering, and doing odd jobs, just so he'd never be embarrassed. It wasn't luxury I offered. It was dignity. And now, hearing that my dedication wasn't enough hurt more than any illness could. It was as if all the scars in my life were screaming at once, but no one was listening. In meetings, he'd get impatient when I suggested simplicity. "Mom, you always want to save money. Don't you realize this is unique?" Oh, as if I didn't know what unique is. The first tooth that fell out, the first step he took, the first word he spoke, that was unique. And I was there, present, whole. And he, in that moment, seemed to have forgotten that the value of something unique isn't measured in dollar signs. I didn't hate him, I never could. But I confess, the hurt grew silently inside me. It was as if each word he said was a brick placed on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I smiled to hide it, but deep down I felt drowned. In gratitude, when it comes from a stranger, we shake it off and let it go. But when it comes from our own blood, oh, it has the bitter taste of poison. There was a day when he said, almost laughing, "Mom, if you didn't have this obsession with simplicity, my life would have been so much easier." I stared at him, trying to find in that face the boy I'd cradled in my arms. I couldn't find it. Instead, there was a man who spoke to me as if I were an obstacle, not a root. That pierced me like a dagger. And the worst part, he didn't even notice. I remember that after that conversation, I went to the kitchen and sat alone. I made a strong coffee, the kind that wakes your heart. The tears fell without asking permission. I cried not because of the harshness of his words, but because of his blindness. Not seeing the mother, who was always there, that was what hurt the most. Because a lifetime of sacrifices can't be erased with a single, vacuous phrase. But in that moment it felt like it could. I've become a woman accustomed to holding the world alone. I've held it together when I was widowed early. I've held it together when food was scarce and bills piled up. I've held it together when my health failed and I had to smile so as not to worry anyone. But bearing the ingratitude of a child, that's a weight that can't be shared. No neighbor, friend, or priest can ease it. It's pure, cruel, silent loneliness. I looked at him and remembered the past. The little boy who, at school, would hand me drawings with hearts and say, "I love you, Mommy." Where was that boy now? Had he lost his way, or had the brightness of the world blinded him forever? I wondered, unanswered. And my heart, oh, my heart was filling with invisible cracks. Still, I didn't give up believing that one day he would realize. A mother's love is stubborn. It doesn't fade easily. It doesn't tire easily. It doesn't surrender easily. Even when hurt, it persists. It insists on hoping. It insists on believing. It insists on loving. And it was this stubbornness that kept me going, even when I no longer had the strength to support myself. But deep down, I already sensed it. Life still had a cruel way of proving to me that his ingratitude wasn't just a phase. It was a harbinger of something even more painful to come, and something I couldn't avoid. I woke early that morning, before the sun even rose. The silence in the house seemed heavier than ever, as if every wall held the secret of what was about to happen. I made a strong coffee, but I could barely drink it. My heart was beating fast, not with joy, but with a mixture of anxiety and foreboding. I knew that day was supposed to be a day of celebration, but inside me there was already something cloudy, a sky about to collapse. As I got ready, I felt the weight of age on my bones. Each button on my dress seemed to require more patience than I had. I looked in the mirror and saw a tired but determined woman. I adjusted my gray hair, put on a subtle lipstick, and took a deep breath. It wasn't vanity. It was respect for the moment. I needed to be whole, even if inside I was shattered. The church was beautiful. The flowers exuded a fresh scent, mingled with the light incense wafting through the air. The lit candles gave the altar a soft glow, and the quiet sound of the guitar filled the space with serenity. I should have been at peace, but my soul found no rest. I walked through the pews, greeting relatives and friends, hiding the storm consuming me behind practiced smiles. I saw my son from a distance, in an impeccable suit, with a practiced smile and restless eyes. He seemed happy, but it wasn't the simple happiness I expected. It was a forced joy, as if every detail was being measured, weighed, evaluated to satisfy not my heart, but the gaze of others. I watched him in silence, and a deep sadness washed over me. Where was the boy who ran barefoot in the yard? Guests arrived, conversations multiplied, noise filled the air. But all I could hear was my own heart pounding. I clutched the ceremony program in my hands, my fingers trembling. I tried to distract myself by observing the people's outfits, the details of the decorations, but nothing could drown out that nagging feeling that something was wrong, that this day held a hidden wound. When the clock announced the hour, the bells began to ring. The metallic sound reverberated within my chest, as if each chime reminded me that time cannot be reversed. I felt my eyes well up, not just with emotion, but with a silent mourning for everything that had been lost between us. And yet, I forced a smile, because a mother learns to smile even when her heart bleeds. The bridesmaids walked past in their pale dresses, scattering petals down the aisle. Everyone was enchanted, and so was I, but behind the enchantment lay a sense of dread. I remembered my parents' wedding, simple and full of truth. I remembered my own ceremony, modest and joyful. And I thought, how did we get here, where love seems less than appearance? As I waited for the bride to enter, I saw my son approach the altar. His eyes swept over the guests, assessing them like someone checking out the audience. And in that instant, even before any cruel words were spoken, I knew he wasn't living a wedding, he was putting on a show. And I, a supporting actor, would be forced to watch from the front row, unable to intervene. Every moment, I felt a lump in my throat. I wanted to speak, I wanted to scream, I wanted to remind him of everything we'd built together, but I kept quiet. Because a mother learns early on that there are times when silence speaks louder than any speech. But inside me, the silence was already starting to hurt like a knife. And so, between forced smiles and teary eyes, I prepared myself. The ceremony was about to begin, and with it, the wound that would forever change the course of our relationship. I didn't yet know the depth of the pain that would come minutes later, but I already sensed that nothing would be the same again. It was just before the ceremony began. I was near the sacristy, adjusting the bride's veil with the delicacy of someone who didn't want to steal the spotlight. My heart was beating fast, and all I could think about was maintaining my composure. It was then that my son approached. He was elegant, impeccable in his dark suit, but his eyes, his eyes held a coldness that sent chills down my spine. I felt something heavy coming, but not even in my worst nightmares could I have imagined what I would hear. He leaned in slightly, as if about to confide something intimate, and said softly, in the most cutting voice I'd ever heard, "If you were already dead, my marriage would have been better. I'd already have my inheritance." The words fell on me like ice cubes. For a moment, I thought I'd heard wrong, that my old mind had played a cruel trick. "But no," he repeated, almost in an angry whisper, and each syllable sank into me like a sharp blade. I froze. The noise of the guests, the distant sound of the guitar, everything faded. It was as if the world had gone silent, so those words could echo inside my head. My legs felt weak, my fingers trembled, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. I never thought I'd hear my own son wishing me away, worse, wishing me dead. I wanted to respond, I wanted to scream, I wanted to ask, "Is this really what you want? The death of the mother who gave you life?" But nothing came out. My throat closed, my mouth dried, and only my heart screamed inside, beating in despair. In that moment, I realized that there is pain that doesn't need a knife or a bullet to kill. All it takes is a poisoned phrase, spoken by the one we love most. I looked into his eyes, searching for some immediate regret, some tremor that would contradict what he'd just said. But I saw only impatience, haste, as if what he'd said were banal, almost natural. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and walked back to the altar without looking back. And I stood there, alone, feeling as if the ground had fallen away beneath my feet. As the guests settled into their seats, I was still trying to catch my breath. The pain wasn't just in my chest, it was all over my body. My face burned, my hands were freezing, and the tears wanted to escape, but couldn't. I couldn't let anyone see that behind that smiling mother lay a broken woman. It was my son's wedding, and I would have to swallow the greatest humiliation of my life. I thought about the years I spent caring for him. I remembered his first high fever, the sleepless nights, the mended clothes so he'd never miss me. I remembered every "I love you, Mom" I'd ever heard, and I felt as if all those memories were being pushed into a bottomless abyss.
Who was that man before me?
Where was the boy I'd raised? The guitar began to strum its first notes, and the church doors opened for the bride. Everyone smiled, their eyes turning to the illuminated aisle. But I remained there, trapped inside. The world celebrated, but inside me was an invisible funeral. The burial of the mother I believed was for him. Halfway through the song, I closed my eyes for a few seconds. I said a quick, almost desperate prayer. Lord, give me the strength not to fall apart here. Give me the strength to hold on. Because I knew, if I did, I would ruin a day that was supposed to be a celebration. So, with a fake smile stitched onto my face, I returned to my seat, feeling my heart throb like an open wound. But I knew, deep down, that those words would never leave my memory. They would be etched in me like a hot iron. And, even without understanding, I sensed that later that day he would experience a shock that would change everything. But until then, I would have to bear the weight of that phrase, echoing like a sentence within me. When I returned to my seat in the church pew, I felt my entire body shudder. It was as if an invisible blade had pierced my chest, and with each breath, it cut a little deeper. The scent of the flowers, which had once been pleasant, now cloyed. The candlelight, which had once warmed, now burned my eyes. And the soft thrum of the guitar became a distant, melodyless hum. I was there, but I wasn't anymore. Something in me had been ripped away without warning. I clutched the rosary beads I carried in my purse. The beads slipped through my fingers, wet with the cold sweat running down my palms. I mentally repeated an ancient prayer, but the words came out jumbled, as if my mouth had forgotten the language of faith. It was a strange sensation, being surrounded by people at a party and at the same time experiencing a silent mourning. Mourning for the mother I was to him, for the love he thought was intact. The voices around me were muffled. Someone touched my shoulder, asked if I was okay. I forced a smile, the smile only a mother can give, wide on the outside, shattered on the inside. Yes, I am, I replied, without being. Because, in that moment, I didn't want to expose my wound. I just wanted to survive the pain without anyone noticing, as if I were carrying a time bomb in my chest. My heart raced so fast, I feared I might faint. I took a deep breath, trying to remember good times to hold on to my sanity. I remembered him when he was small, his feet dirty with dirt, running around the yard. I remembered his sweet laugh, the way he'd hug me, hiding his face in my neck. That memory came like a wave, crashing hard, and nearly knocked me over. Who would have thought that same boy with open arms would one day stab me like that? As the bride walked down the aisle, I tried to compose myself, but her every step echoed like a hammer in my heart. It was the sound of a moment that should have been joy, but was becoming torture. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, I wanted to disappear. But I stayed. A mother stays, even when everything inside her is begging her to leave. The tears I'd been holding back since the moment I said them began to well up in the corners of my eyes. I blinked several times, biting my lip to keep them from falling. I knew that if the first tear escaped, a flood would follow. And I didn't want anyone to see the groom's mother crying on his wedding day, unaware that those tears weren't from emotion, but from pain. With every glance I gave him, I felt a mixture of love and disbelief. He seemed so calm, so in control, as if nothing had happened minutes before. He chatted with the groomsmen, smiled at the guests, straightened his jacket. And there I was, feeling my chest explode. It was like being invisible. Invisible to my own son. Invisible to my own story. My hands began to feel numb, a chill creeping up my legs. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I kept thinking, not here, not now. It was a desperate mantra because my heart seemed to have a will of its own. And yet, I remained seated, motionless, like a statue in the midst of the bustling room. I looked at the altar, the candles, the crucifix. I tried to find some solace in faith, but at that moment even God seemed distant. It was as if I were alone, completely alone, surrounded by people, music, flowers. Alone in the middle of what should have been one of the happiest days of his life. But even torn apart, a part of me resisted. Resisted for him, resisted for myself, resisted for the history I carried. Because despite the stabbing, I was still a mother. And mothers, oh, mothers endure pain that has no name. I knew that moment would mark me forever. What I didn't know was that, within hours, something would happen that would change not only that day, but everything between us. When the music stopped and the applause began, I felt the weight of my own body. It was as if every cell was tired, begging to sit down, to close my eyes and disappear. But I remained standing. The silence I carried wasn't just an absence of voice, it was a shield. A shield to protect me and, somehow, also protect this moment that should have been happy. I knew any word I said could become a shard, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin my son's day. I clutched the rosary tightly inside my purse. The beads seemed to pulse like a heart, reminding me that I was still breathing. With every step, I whispered to myself, "Stay strong. Don't ruin his day. Stay strong." It was a kind of mantra, a sewing thread I used to keep from falling apart. Because, deep down, I wanted to scream, to ask questions, to shake him by the shoulders. But I chose to remain silent. And silence hurts. I sat on the bench and arranged my dress on my lap, like someone arranging themselves to appear complete. Around me, I saw happy faces, animated conversations, people who imagined they were watching a perfect story. No one knew that, behind my smile, there was an abyss. No one suspected that, within the mother of the groom's chest, lurked a silent storm. And I, out of pride and love, maintained my disguise. I glanced at him several times during the ceremony. I saw the way he smiled at the bride, the way he held her hands, the way he looked at the guests. I also saw the rush in his eyes, the need for approval, as if the whole thing were a carefully staged spectacle. And I thought, will he ever understand the price of what he said to me? As the priest spoke, his words jumbled together in my head, meaningless. It was like listening to a language I didn't understand. I felt only the weight of what was inside me. A thick, slow pain that wouldn't go away. A pain that wasn't just mine. It was part of our history. Of the mother who had always been there and the son who, suddenly, wished her dead in exchange for money. There was a moment when the bride glanced at me, half sideways, as if she'd noticed something. Her gaze was shy, almost sympathetic. Perhaps she didn't know what had happened, but she sensed something was wrong. I returned it with a slight smile, the kind we used to say, everything's okay when it's not. Mothers are experts at that kind of smile. I took a deep breath and tried to think of something else. The smell of flowers, the distant sound of the guitar, the light streaming through the stained glass windows. But everything seemed tinged with gray. What should have been the color of celebration was now the color of mourning. I was alive, but inside I felt dead. And yet, even torn apart, I held on. Because that's what a mother did. Stayed. When the priest asked everyone to stand, I obeyed mechanically, like a puppet. I felt my knee ache, my shoe pinch, but I didn't show it. I clutched my bag tighter, like someone holding a secret. And I kept smiling, while inside I repeated, "Hold on. Just a little longer. Hold on." I knew that silence wouldn't save me forever. At some point, I would have to speak, react, show what was behind it. But not now. Not in front of everyone. Not on the day that was supposed to be his. I held on to the last shred of dignity I had left, swallowing every tear that threatened to fall. And there, in that heavy silence, I understood something. Sometimes silence is more painful than speaking. But silence is also an act of love. The silent love of a wounded mother trying to protect her son even when he doesn't deserve it. I just didn't know that that silence would be the last time I tried to protect him. Something much bigger was about to happen, and I had no idea that my life would change completely that very day. I took a deep breath, sat up straighter, and swallowed hard. The ceremony had to continue. The priest spoke, the music filled the church, the guests sighed with emotion, and there I was, with a hole in my chest, trying to follow each moment. It was as if I were watching it all from behind thick glass, watching the images move silently, unable to touch them. I knew I had to maintain my composure, because all the cameras were trained on us. It was my son's wedding. It couldn't be the scene of my collapse. As the bride and groom exchanged knowing glances, I remembered so many promises I'd made to myself. I promised that at his wedding, I would cry with pride. I promised I'd hug him at the altar and say, "You made your mother happy." But at that moment, I only wanted to cry from pain, not emotion. My eyes were watering, but I maintained the forced smile only mothers can muster when their hearts are broken. I looked around and saw all the guests marveling at the scene. It was as if we were in a perfect movie. The radiant bride, the elegant groom, the decorated church. But only I knew what was really happening. Inside, I felt a suffocating weight. It was the weight of a lifetime of effort transformed into ingratitude. The weight of a love that, suddenly, was worthless compared to money. As the vows were said, I wondered if he remembered me, our history, the sacrifices. Did he, at least in that moment, feel some gratitude? Or did the cold words he'd spoken to me before the ceremony echo in his mind as they did in mine? I looked at him, searching for a crack in his face, but I saw nothing. Just that perfect mask. With each round of applause, my heart pounded. It was like being in a theater, watching a play starring me, but with an unfamiliar script. I felt small, almost invisible, in the crowd. And at the same time, I felt a strange force growing within me, a silent force that said, "Hang on a little longer. Soon everything will change." It was as if fate were preparing a counterattack. The soft music of the guitar brought back memories. I remembered the day I bought him his first dress shoe to wear to a high school graduation. He was proud of them, spending hours staring at himself in the mirror. And now, so many years later, I looked at the grown man in the expensive suit and saw that, despite everything, the boy was still there somewhere, only covered in layers of vanity and haste. The bride's glances toward me began to catch my attention. She glanced at me from time to time, with a mixture of compassion and discomfort. Perhaps she sensed something was wrong. Perhaps she had heard something. I don't know. But that silent look told me that she, at least, didn't share his coldness. I returned a small smile, trying not to convey my pain to her. When the priest asked everyone to stand, I felt my knee buckle. I placed my hand on the pew in front of me to keep from falling. A chill ran down my spine, and for a moment I thought I might faint. But I took a deep breath, clutched the rosary hidden in my purse, and told myself, "Not here.
Not now.
Stay strong." It was almost a prayer, almost a command. The rings were brought by a child in the family, and the innocence of that gesture made me choke back tears. I remembered when he was a child, carrying the rings at a cousin's wedding. I remembered the sparkle in his eyes, the way he hugged me afterward. Life truly is a strange cycle. One day we're children carrying rings, the next we're adults breaking hearts. And so the ceremony continued, as if everything was perfect. On the outside, I was the smiling mother of the groom. On the inside, I was a wounded woman, silently bleeding. But a part of me knew, felt, deep down, that the day wasn't over yet, that something much bigger was about to happen, something that would make my son finally see who I was and the price of the words he'd spoken to me. As the ceremony progressed, I kept my head held high and my heart silent. No one there imagined that, behind my simplicity, I carried a closely guarded secret. I've always preferred to live discreetly, without flaunting my possessions, because I learned early on that wealth without value is just dead weight. And yet, inside my purse, along with the rosary, were documents that, if revealed, would make many of those invited see my true colors. On the outside, I was just the groom's simple mother. On the inside, she was a woman who built an empire with sweat and intelligence. A billionaire, yes, but invisible by choice. I never wanted my son to grow up believing that money would solve all his problems. I wanted to teach him that character is the only inheritance that never fades. That's why I kept it a secret, even when I could have lived in luxury. I preferred the easy life. I preferred anonymity. There were nights when I considered revealing everything. He would arrive tired, frustrated with life, and I would almost open my mouth to say, "My son, you don't need to worry. Your future is already secured." But I always bit back my words. I wanted him to be strong, to build his own story, not to depend on an inheritance to feel proud of himself. It was a hard but necessary choice. However, in that church, still hearing the cruel words he had said echo within me, I realized the irony of life. He believed he would only have a better marriage if I were dead, and he had received my inheritance. And I didn't know I was already surrounded by an incalculable fortune. A fortune that had always been there, waiting, but which I kept silent to preserve values that now seemed lost. I looked at him at the altar and wondered, if I had told him sooner, would he have been different? Would the weight of wealth have shaped a different character? Or would it have completely ruined the boy who once held my hand in the backyard? Questions like these have no answers. I only know that deep down my silence was also a test, and he was failing. I guarded the truth like someone who keeps a jewel deep in a safe. Only I knew the size of the fortune I had inherited from my father, a respected businessman who always taught me never to mix ostentation with dignity. "Discretion is power," he said. And I followed his instructions to the letter. I spent decades without revealing the true extent of my wealth to anyone. Not even my son, who now looked at me as if I were just a stingy old woman who didn't want to invest in his marriage. The cruelest thing was knowing he judged me with contempt, believing I didn't want to spend out of poverty or stinginess. It never occurred to him that I could afford the most luxurious wedding in the entire city and still have money left over. And it was this blindness that hurt me the most. Because true luxury isn't in spending, but in knowing when it's not necessary. I felt like a hidden figure, a queen disguised as a peasant at her own party. I watched the guests, who laughed and toasted, unaware that the discreet lady sitting on the bench possessed more than all of them combined. And at the same time, this awareness didn't bring me pride, but rather anguish. Because what's the point of having so much if not even your own son knows how to value the essentials? In that moment, I realized that maybe it wasn't me keeping the secret. Maybe it was the secret keeping me. It protected me from the world, but it also isolated me. And now, faced with the ingratitude of the one I loved most, it weighed more heavily than ever. The silence that had once been a shield began to turn into a prison. And I knew that secret wouldn't stay hidden for long. Fate, capricious as it always has been with me, was already stirring behind the scenes to bring to light what I'd hidden for years. And when it came to light, my son would know not only the truth, but also the bitter price of his own words. I built my life like someone embroidering a vast fabric, stitch by stitch, day after day, without haste or fanfare. The legacy I carry today wasn't born ready-made. It began small, on my father's land, in the family businesses he entrusted to me when I was still young. While many were dazzled by the quick glitter of easy money, I learned to invest patiently, to cultivate solid and quiet businesses, like ancient trees that grow slowly but surely. I've never made a point of showing off. While others bought the latest cars, I bought real estate. While others traveled to expensive destinations, I reinvested my profits. Not out of greed, but because I understood that true wealth isn't what's on display. It's what sustains me. This choice gave me freedom, freedom to raise my son with dignity, freedom to never have to ask anyone for anything, freedom to choose anonymity. Most people always saw me as a simple lady, with understated dresses, worn-out handbags, and no-name shoes. And I let them think that way. It was a natural disguise, almost a habit, because I knew those who show everything lose power. And I wanted to protect my son, not impress him. Over time, the inheritance multiplied, not only in money, but in wisdom. I learned to diversify, to save for the bad days, to not depend on applause. I learned that wealth isn't just about a bank balance, it's about having character when no one's looking. And that was the legacy I always wanted to pass on to him. But seeing him in that church, I realized I might have failed. He looked at me as if I were a poor woman, unable to afford his dream. He didn't know that if I'd wanted to, I could have closed the most expensive venues, hired the most sought-after musicians, and made his wedding look like a fairy tale. But I didn't. And that, for him, was unforgivable. For me, it was necessary. I kept every important document, signed contracts, and secret investments in safe deposit boxes. I always had trusted partners who respected my desire for anonymity. Not even my closest friends imagined the extent of my fortune. And I was proud of it, because silence is a kind of shield. And shielding protects not only assets, but also valuables. Sometimes on lonely nights, I wondered if this secret was a gift or a burden. Having too much money and not being able to talk about it is like carrying a crown hidden under a blanket. It shines, but it also weighs heavily. And in that church, watching my son humiliate me, I felt that weight to the limit. I wish I could say, "My son, all this is yours. It's already yours." But not like this. Not with such ingratitude. But I held back the words. Because I knew that, revealed too soon, the invisible inheritance could do even more damage. Sometimes the worst thing we can give someone is everything. As the priest continued the ceremony, I felt torn between two identities, the simple mother everyone saw, and the powerful woman no one knew. It was like living two lives at once. And in that moment, I felt the two about to collide in a way I couldn't control. And I had a feeling that life was setting up the perfect scenario for my secret to come to light. Not because I wanted it to, but because sooner or later, the truth always finds a way to come out. And when it did, my son would not only know who I was, but would have to face the weight of his own words. The reception was held in an elegant, yet unostentatious, hall. There were light tablecloths, subtle flowers, and soft lighting that created a cozy atmosphere. I walked between the tables, greeting family and friends, smiling at everyone, but inside I still carried the weight of the words my son had said to me hours earlier. I tried to hold myself together, trying to convince myself that the worst was over. Little did I know that fate was just preparing to surprise me. An old business friend, a companion of decades, approached me with a broad smile. He had always been discreet, like me, but he had a habit of making small tributes at important moments. He took the microphone casually and asked for the guests' attention. "Before we begin the party, I'd like to say a few words to the groom's mother," he said, looking in my direction. I felt a chill run down my spine. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me, and before I could protest, he began to tell me about my career. He told me how, years ago, I took on delicate business dealings, how I turned inheritances into empires, how I'm known behind the scenes as one of the most discreet and successful women in the country. His words sounded like thunder in a sky I wished to keep hidden. As he spoke, I saw the guests' eyes widen in surprise. Whispers began to spread, cell phones were raised, some people recorded. My secret, kept for so many years, was being revealed there, in front of everyone, without my having any control. I felt my heart race, torn between anger at the exposure and the certainty that nothing happens by chance. My son, seated at the head table, froze. His eyes widened, his mouth hanging open, as if he'd been hit by an invisible punch. I could clearly see the weight of the revelation fall upon him. There was the mother he'd thought was poor and stingy, transformed into a billionaire in front of the guests. It was the shock of a lifetime condensed into seconds. The friend, unaware of the impact he was making, continued, "Few people know, but she was the one who helped keep major companies in this city afloat. She was the one who, with her vision, multiplied fortunes and jobs. This woman is an example of wisdom, strength, and quiet generosity." Each sentence felt like a hammer pounding on my son's heart. People began to applaud me. The sound of applause filled the hall, but inside me there was only silence. I didn't need that applause. I never had. But there, in that moment, it became the public revelation of what I had always hidden. And more than for me, it was a sentence for him, confirmation that everything he had said to me earlier was fraught with ingratitude. I saw his face change. From shock to embarrassment, from embarrassment to shame. It was as if the cruel words he had spoken echoed in his mind, mixed with the sound of applause that now celebrated the mother he had humiliated. And I, silent, just watched him, because there was no need for words. Life, in itself, was already teaching him the lesson I had never managed to teach him. In that moment, I realized fate had chosen to expose my secret not to aggrandize me, but to unmask his contempt. It was as if the universe had been waiting for this very day, this very ceremony, to show me who I truly was and to show him who he had become. And I, sitting there amidst the applause, with a restrained smile and a silent heart, had only one thought: will he be able to bear the weight of this revelation? Because the mask he wore was beginning to crack before everyone's eyes. And when it finally fell, nothing would ever be the same. The room, previously filled with light laughter and lively conversation, took on a different atmosphere. The air seemed to vibrate, as if each guest were in a trance, absorbing this unexpected revelation. People glanced at each other, whispered, and raised their eyebrows in astonishment. Some even stood up, trying to get a better look at me, as if I had suddenly transformed into a different person. The simple mother in the understated dress was no longer the same in their eyes. I could hear the phrases being exchanged between tables. Her? A billionaire? Always so reserved. Who would have thought? My God, and we thought she lived modestly. It was like watching a wave spreading silently but powerfully, sweeping away everything in its path. The impact wasn't just the wealth revealed, but the contrast between the image I'd always portrayed and the truth that, until then, no one had suspected. Cell phones were raised again. Flashbulbs began to pop. Discreet recordings were made. I felt like, within hours, word of this would spread, maybe even in the local papers. And suddenly I realized how exposed I was. But instead of fear, I felt a strange calm. It was as if, finally, the burden of hiding had been lifted without me having to lift a finger. My son, however, seemed petrified. The fork fell from his hand and made a small metallic sound that, to me, echoed louder than the earlier applause. He stared at me, his face pale, his mouth half open. I could almost hear his thoughts screaming, "What have I done?" Every second was a sentence weighing down on his shoulders. The bride, beside him, tried to hide her embarrassment. She squeezed his hand, whispered something in his ear, but he didn't react. It was as if he were frozen in his own mistake. From where I stood, I could feel his gaze burning in my direction, not with pride, but with regret and shame. And that, I confess, hurt more than any previous criticism. Some guests, sensing the tension, came up to me. "Congratulations, you deserve all the recognition," they said. I smiled politely, but my heart remained heavy. Because that public recognition, honorable as it was, didn't erase the intimate pain of being humiliated by my own son just hours before. I could see the groomsmen whispering, some even looking directly at him. It was inevitable. The cruel words he had said to me, even though no one else knew, now echoed within him with an unbearable weight. In front of the audience, he looked like the happy groom, but inside I knew he was already consumed by shame. The hall now wasn't just celebrating the wedding. It was celebrating the revelation of a woman who had remained invisible by choice, but who in that moment became the center of attention. And my son, who had always craved the spotlight, found himself erased by the unexpected light of truth. It was the irony of life unfolding before everyone, in real time. I, with the serenity of someone who's lived too long to be impressed, simply held my gaze. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to justify anything. My silence was answer enough. And in that silence, his heart began to shatter. And while the guests continued to chat, toast, and try to grasp the magnitude of what they had just discovered, I already knew. The surprise wouldn't end there. What came next would be even more powerful, because a public revelation not only reveals who we are, but forces others to face who they truly are. He stood motionless. The fork that had fallen onto his plate still vibrated, making a metallic sound that seemed to echo throughout the room. His face drained of color, and I could see, even from a distance, the exact moment his conscience sank. It was as if all the cruel words he'd said to me minutes before had returned like arrows, stabbing deep. I saw in his eyes the mixture of shock and despair, the sudden realization that I'd hurt the wrong person at the worst possible time. His hand trembled slightly. The distressed bride tried to calm him, but no gesture could soothe what was happening inside him. The pride that had once held his body erect now melted into shame. He looked away, trying to compose himself, but the guests still watched him. Perhaps they didn't know the cruel words he'd said to me, but they sensed something wasn't right. And this realization increased the weight of the mask he tried to maintain. Regret isn't a loud pain. It's silent, corrosive, gnawing away at the inside until nothing remains. I watched my son sink into this pain before my eyes. He fidgeted with his napkin, straightened his jacket, drank water without thirst. Nervous, small gestures that only betrayed the restlessness of his soul. It was as if he wanted to disappear, to hide from everyone, and especially from me. I, sitting across the room, said nothing. I simply stared at him, serene, with a steady gaze he couldn't hold. I didn't need to utter a single word. My silence was the mirror in which he saw himself, and he didn't like what he saw. For the first time, perhaps, he saw himself without the adornments of vanity. And the reflection was too harsh. As my friend continued to praise me into the microphone, extolling accomplishments I'd always kept anonymous, I could see my son's face contort. Each word was a hammer blow to his conscience. Each round of applause was a reminder of the mistake he'd made. Immediate regret came not as an apology, but as a lost look, a defeated expression, a silence too heavy for his age. Some guests noticed. They whispered, "The groom seems strange, doesn't he? Isn't he happy?" I heard these fragments and thought, if only they knew. If only they knew what I'd heard from him hours earlier, perhaps they'd understand the reason for his discomfort. But this was a wound that was unique to us, a scar no one else could see, though everyone could feel its shadow in the air. The bride, brave, held his hand and smiled to hide it. But her eyes were trembling too. Perhaps he had heard something, perhaps he just sensed it. Women always sense what men try to hide. And she realized there was a chasm between the spectacle of the party and the intimate reality of his heart. A chasm opened by a single sentence, impossible to bridge. Regret is cruel because it cannot be reversed. He probably wished at that moment he had never said those words. Perhaps he wished I were, in fact, the simple woman he believed, so that his cruelty would carry less weight. But no, now he knew he had spat venom at the very mother who had given him the most. And the knowledge of this truth was a punishment greater than any sermon could inflict. As I smiled at the guests and received hugs I didn't care about, I knew my son was being crushed by his own mistake. I didn't need to humiliate him. I didn't need to expose him. Life already did that for me. The immediate regret was written all over his face, and nothing could erase it. But I also knew that immediate regret was only the beginning. The wound would still grow, the mask would still slip, and the lesson wasn't yet complete. The night was just beginning, and the weight of what he'd said to me would still have much more to exact. The guests tried to maintain the euphoria of the party, but I could see in the watchful eyes of many that my son's posture was no longer convincing. The smile he forced was crooked, lifeless. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, that doesn't warm. The groomsmen exchanged discreet glances, as if noticing a flaw in the show, and I silent watched. I knew his mask was about to shatter. He tried to joke with his bride, raising glasses, shaking hands, but each gesture was empty, almost mechanical. With each round of applause directed at me, he seemed to shrink a little more. Shame weighed on his shoulders, hunching his once proud posture. He no longer knew how to move without appearing artificial. And the more he tried to hide it, the more obvious it became. People began to whisper, "The groom doesn't look happy, isn't that strange? He's pale." Those comments reached my ears like tiny cracks of glass. I watched my son squirm, trying to maintain his image of a fulfilled man, but the truth was that his own conscience had already shattered the act. When one of my uncles came to greet me and said loudly, "Congratulations, your creation is exemplary," his face tightened. It was brief, but I saw it. His mask cracked right there, in that instant. The pride he'd always carried like armor fell away, replaced by an expression of discomfort no one could ignore. Even his fiancée squeezed his hand tighter, as if to say, "Get a grip." He stood to make a toast, but his voice faltered. The words came out jumbled, unsteady, stumbling over his own regret. He tried to thank me, but his eyes kept straying from me, as if facing my presence were unbearable. Those in the room might not understand why, but everyone felt the weight. The groom was no longer the same. I, for my part, said nothing. I kept my face serene, a restrained half-smile. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to expose him. The fall of the mask wasn't my doing, but his. Life, wise as ever, was already taking care of exposing what was hidden. Some guests even tried to justify it to each other. "It's just emotion. That's how marriage is." But I knew it wasn't emotion, it was weight. The weight of every word he'd spewed at me, now multiplied by the revelation of my fortune. It wasn't nerves, it was conscience. And conscience, when it awakens suddenly, leaves no one standing. He avoided looking at me, but I could feel his eyes searching my path. Perhaps he was looking for a gesture from me that would soothe him, a silent complicity.
But I didn't give him that.
Not this time. Because I knew, if I soothed him, he'd forget the lesson. And some lessons need discomfort to sink in. The entire hall might not have known about our secret wound, but everyone sensed something had broken. The mask of arrogance he'd so long maintained slipped completely, and from then on, nothing he did would shine the same way. He became transparent, and everyone saw not the happy groom, but the small man before the greatness he himself had despised. And I, sitting with the serenity of someone who has lived too long to be astonished, just thought, the mask has fallen, and now he will have to learn to live with his face bare, without disguise, before me and before everyone. That was my chance. I could have stood up, asked for the microphone, and exposed everything. The cruel words he had said to me before the ceremony, the ingratitude he carried within, the difference between the son I raised and the man he presented himself to everyone. One gesture, one well-placed sentence, and I could have turned him to dust in front of that audience. But no, I chose silence. Silence not out of cowardice, but out of wisdom. While the guests applauded me, while curious eyes probed me as if wanting to discover more about my fortune, I kept my mouth shut. I didn't smile too much. I didn't cry too much. I didn't gesture. I simply stood there, present whole, because I've learned throughout life that true power doesn't need to shout. True power knows how to be silent. And in that moment, my silence weighed more heavily than any speech. My son watched me from time to time, perhaps waiting for a reaction, perhaps a spiteful look, a gesture of revenge. But I gave him serenity. It was as if I were saying without words, "You're already learning your lesson. I don't need to teach you." I saw the discomfort growing in him, saw his skin crawl, saw his fingers fidget on the towel. He wanted me to say anything to ease the guilt, but I didn't. This silence was my way of returning the wound, not with revenge, but with dignity, because dignity is the only currency that cannot be spent, lost, or exchanged. I felt like every second I remained silent was like a wall rising between us, a wall he wouldn't have the strength to break down anytime soon. Some guests even tried to make conversation. "Did you know you'd be honored today? What's it like to have so much and never have shown it?" I responded with short, polite sentences, without elaborating. This wasn't the time to talk about numbers. It was time to let the silence do the hardest work, corroding my son's conscience from within. The poor bride understood. He looked at me with respect, and perhaps even admiration. I saw the silent question in his eyes. "How do you manage to stay so strong?" And I just gave him a calm look, as if to say, "Daughter, time has taught me." Because time, yes, is the greatest teacher of all. I felt my silence begin to bother me more than if I had shouted. The atmosphere around the head table grew heavy. My son, who had always sought the spotlight, was now obscured by the shadow of his own guilt. And I, who had never sought applause, now received it all effortlessly. It was the irony of life manifesting itself in an almost cruel way. Inside me, an ancient voice repeated, "Don't stoop to his level." And I obeyed. I held my pain, cradled my sorrow, and remained still, because I had learned that a mother's silence, when wounded, can be louder than any words. And there, in front of everyone, that silence became a sentence. But don't think it was easy. Inside, my heart screamed, my body begged to vent. I wanted to say everything. I wanted to ask in front of everyone, was this the mother you wanted dead so you could inherit the inheritance? Was this the one you humiliated before the altar? But I didn't. I swallowed every word, because I knew life was already speaking for me. And so I remained silent. A heavy, relentless silence, impossible to ignore. A silence that would force him to look in the mirror after that night and see, without apology, the man he had become. Because sometimes the greatest punishment isn't what a mother says. It's what a mother keeps silent. When the music started again and the guests resumed their toasts, I realized my son was no longer in tune with the party. His body remained there, but his soul seemed distant. He fiddled with his glass without drinking, adjusted his jacket repeatedly, and avoided talking to anyone who tried to make conversation. It was clear. Something inside him had broken, and I knew exactly what it was. It was the weight of his own conscience finally knocking on the door. From where I stood, I could see how he avoided meeting my gaze. Every time our eyes happened to meet, he quickly looked away, as if embarrassed by his own reflection. It was as if the phrase he'd said to me before the ceremony was being repeated inside him, loud and clear, over and over. "If you had already died, my marriage would have been better." Now, however, these words sounded not like triumph, but like venom. The bride, attentive, caressed his hand under the table, trying to bring some relief. But the discomfort wouldn't subside. I saw concern in her eyes, perhaps even fear that her groom wasn't truly present in what should have been one of the happiest moments of their lives. It was as if she, too, had realized something was wrong, something that not even her love could cure. He forced a smile when someone approached, but the smile had no roots. It was a smile that faded before it even began. The guests might not know the reason, but they felt the weight in the air. And that weight wasn't mine, it was his. It was the burden of a heart that, for the first time, found itself naked before its own cruelty. I imagined the thoughts that must have run through his mind. What did I do? How could I tell my mother that? What if everyone knew? It was a silent whirlwind, an internal judgment far harsher than any public rebuke could be. Because, deep down, no one can escape themselves. Not even him. The ironic thing is that there, in that crowded room, he already had what he so desperately desired: recognition, the spotlight, luxury. But none of that mattered anymore. The money, the spectacle, the appearances, everything crumbled before the silent pain of knowing he had hurt the one who loved him most. He discovered, the hard way, that no amount of wealth could buy respect. I realized that every word my friend said into the microphone, every round of applause I received, was like an open wound for him. Not because they exalted me, but because they reminded me of the contrast between the grandiose mother and the small phrase he had thrown at me. It was as if life had prepared that scenario just to confront him with his own ingratitude. And amidst all the celebration, he sank into an uncomfortable silence. The music, the toasts, the laughter, nothing seemed to reach him. He was trapped within himself, staring at his own error like someone staring into a broken mirror, seeing fragments of what once was, but is no longer.